And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Raw Sportscast Roundtable. I'm your host, Jordan Smith, and today we've got three fantastic guests. We're back with Chris Schill, and today we've got Chris Coleman and Steve Duffy. So welcome. We're going to kick things off real quick. We're not going to beat around the bush a whole lot. Chris Schill, we got two Chris's today, so we might have to be a little specific.
That's okay.
So, Chris, why don't you kick things off?
Oh, I get to kick things off. Scott's not here.
Scott's not here, so we'll give you the...
This is a good topic. We could really argue this one. So I'm thinking athletes and activism.
Athletes and activism. Are we talking like...
I think there's multiple things we can talk about. One, do they have a place when you're getting paid millions of dollars to be as outspoken as they are, or not even. There's local athletes. I think there's a lady that plays rugby locally, Pam Busha, who's very big into activism, supports some great causes. What I want to discuss is how far is too far. The Colin Kaepernick thing. I mean, he was a zero, then he was a hero because everybody got so down on him. He had sponsorships pulled for taking a knee, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh no, now we love you because you supported this amazing cause, and just things like that. Or even if he had have performed better as a quarterback, would people have taken that activism more seriously? Perhaps, I don't know.
Kind of like Megan Rapinoe of the U.S. women's soccer team. She took a lot of heat for taking a knee. But everyone was saying, you don't take a knee when you're representing your country. You can take a knee when you're representing a professional sports team, but not your country.
Okay.
I agree to a point.
Okay. Why? I somewhat understand the difference, but why do you agree to a point?
Well, for one thing, I don't like her stance on the fact that we got beaten by Canada.
I agree.
Immediately, red flags went up when I heard that. But, when you're representing your country, it's an honor to play for your country.
Yes.
When you honor your country, you don't honor it by taking a knee.
I tend to agree with that.
I don't know that I do, actually. I think if you go back to the 1968 Olympics, there were two things that probably are foremost in people's minds. One was John Carlos.
Yes,
his hand in the air.
Panthers, yes.
Oh, yes, I actually just read about that, actually.
And the fellow who came second, another American, also raised his hand, as did the third place runner in the 100 meters. And he was Australian. And he did it in sympathy with their position. If you say you're honoring your country and your country is based in free speech, I'm not sure that, that making a political statement, and we've just come through the Olympics where I think sometimes making a political statement takes you off track from the sport you're there for.
I think that's a good point. I do think.
But I think the Canadian women in softball chose to wear orange shirts because all children matter. Every child matters, and they went on and won a bronze medal. They kept their focus on the pitch, but they were making a very important statement.
And I can understand that to a point. I think that it is a bigger platform to get topics like that heard and to bring things out. And what about the Colin Kaepernick situation? And he's not the only one, but where he took a knee and he was vilified. Let's be honest. I mean, the guy will probably never play an NFL game, and not necessarily based on his performance. He was just blackballed after that.
And it's a shame because he's a darn good quarterback.
I think better than some quarterbacks still in the league, for sure.
I saw an interesting post today on Facebook. It says, Tom Brady, greatest athlete of all time, give me a break. And then they went on, Terry Fox did the equivalent of a marathon a day for 29 days with one leg. And my comment was, well, you can't, if it's not American, it ain't worth crap, Yeah.
Well, the Tom Brady thing, Tom Brady may not be the greatest athlete. I strongly disagree with anybody that says he is.
I absolutely
He may be one of the most accomplished athletes. Yeah. Accomplished and best are not the same.
I agree.
He may be one of the most financially successful athletes, one of the most successful NFL players, that kind of thing, but he's definitely not the best athlete.
greatest quarterback of all
I
time.
will say, bringing up Tom Brady in this actual conversation, I probably don't respect him because he is somebody who stays kind of
Aloof.
quiet and aloof about things,
And he's got the
I
power.
and I actually do respect a lot of the athletes who do come forward and stand for a cause. I sometimes think, unfortunately, it does become a detriment to a team sometimes, just because then the focus becomes on that athlete, and then, I think that, like you were saying, the team begins to lose focus. But
And I think, to be fair to Tom Brady, he is a very good athlete. He was a good mind, but he was half a great partnership, because I don't think you can talk about Tom Brady without also not talking about Bill Belichick. I don't happen to like either of them.
I don't like either of them. But Bill Belichick's
But he
probably
went
got to
and
be the
won a
best
Super Bowl with the
coach
Buccaneers,
of all time.
it wasn't Bill Belichick per se. It was for whomever
I
he
think
was
if you
playing.
look at the Tampa Bay team, that team was built for
Yeah.
Tom Brady.
Yeah.
And they got
Yeah.
lucky that they were able to do that. I'm a Peyton Manning fan, so Peyton all the way.
So back to the activism
Yes.
side of this conversation. There's a lot of athletes that do stand up and use their platform and their fans to bring along political advice, their opinions, what they should do in the political arena. And obviously, the political arena in the United States is very hyper-focused around the world.
Very.
So a lot of athletes who are celebrities have this platform, and then they want to say, vote for X, do this, taking a knee during the anthem. There's also the other side. LeBron James was on the receiving end of some pretty strong words from a Fox News journalist,
Yes.
Laura Ingraham, where she said, shut up and play basketball.
Yes.
You don't need to talk politics. You're a basketball player. Just dribble.
But to me, and with all due respect, I'm not a very big fan of hers. I just, the woman makes me cringe. But it's kind of like George Bush with the Dixie Chicks. Just shut up and play. Well, why? They're still human beings, and they still have a right. Just because they're getting paid money does not mean that they shouldn't be outspoken. And I actually respect athletes that actually stand up for what they believe in, whether I agree with them or not, within boundaries. There's some things that are just totally racist and should not be expressed. If that's your point of view, I feel sorry for you, but I don't think something like that should be expressed. But things that can make a difference in the world, I think, really do need to positivity, kindness.
But look at the recent Olympics again. You had Simone Biles make a personal statement which became political to some people, but it was about, I'm going through a tough time cerebrally, mentally,
Yes.
dealing with this, and I need
We
a break.
spoke of that last roundtable.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
but there's
a big deal.
There's a range of those things. So Clara Hughes, one of my heroes, the only person in the world to be a multiple medalist in both Summer and Winter Olympics, forced Canada to have a discussion about depression and mental health.
Yes, that was one
Okay.
of our topics last week, and
But that's important. That's a statement.
And I think sometimes if you suppress some of your feelings and don't get out there and state what you believe, then we start with mental health issues because you're suppressing everything, and it's boiling in you, and you want to say it on a platform that maybe you can gain some support in.
And what we had because of Simone Biles, we had people then looking back at particularly the U.S. women's gymnastics teams historically saying, okay, some of those things that were seen as positive at the time may have actually been abusive, forcing people to go in and finish events when they could only land on one leg.
Well, yes,
But that's,
it did open a conversation for sure.
And there's different types of activism within the realm of sports.
Absolutely.
You have athletes that come out and physically say something. You've got the Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. He was protesting police brutality.
Yeah.
That's how it started. And then there's the beach volleyball teams, the female beach volleyball teams changing their uniforms. That's another form of activism. And so it's more than just words.
I think as long as it's not a violent act and you're trying to get the point across without being violent, you're doing it peacefully, I think that it's the perfect platform to get people and gain support for certain causes.
People love to worship celebrities, and if celebrities say something, it carries more clout.
well, and what about the positive statements that are made politically? I mean, we had, again, recently, you may have spoken about this last time, I don't know, but Christine Sinclair, they beat the U.S., and she goes and hugs a professional teammate of hers who's dealing with the loss before she celebrates with her team. That's actually a social statement, but a very positive one.
Yeah, it shows compassion.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows what it's like to lose. It is not a great feeling. And
No,
if your
it's awful.
teammate's on the other side, I think the least you can do is go and console them.
But if you're going to castigate the negative statement, then you have to think about also castigating the positive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's a good way to wrap that one up. Let's move on. Topic number 2. Steve, what do you got for us?
Well, I'd like to talk about the what on paper or on the surface look like the opposing sports of cricket and rugby, with which Chris Coleman here has a background deep in both.
Good
Oh,
he
so
does,
we've got an
'cause
expert. I've got a surface level knowledge
I
of
barely
both.
have a surface level of either, except I lived in Australia and spent days watching cricket test matches.
You're ahead of most people.
Was it the same match?
Yes.
Yes, like Australia, New Zealand for days.
Okay, I'll start this out. Cricket and rugby are not massive sports in Canada. Rugby is gaining
It's
steam.
gaining momentum.
It's
for sure.
it's definitely gaining momentum. I think cricket is definitely one of the smaller sports. Here in the Greater Victoria area, we do have a cricket pitch that is used quite regularly, and I've had the opportunity to watch.
We have a number of them, actually.
Yeah, well, there you go. I thought there was only one.
I
So,
didn't even know there was one.
Let's
so
start
there we
with
are.
Chris. I'm going to ask you this: why is rugby exploding now, and why did it take so long?
I think part of it is a tribute to the Canadian women, actually. And women have taken on sports that used to be male-dominated, and
Go girls.
technically they play it often better than the men do.
I have actually heard, like most that I've heard about rugby, because I'll be completely honest, I think I've been to one rugby game, but it is a sport that quite interests
There's
me.
hope for you, though.
Yeah, it does interest me, and maybe after this conversation I may get a little more involved in that. But most of the accolades I hear are for the women.
It's partly because they have a higher position in world rankings, even if they didn't fulfill that hope in the Olympics. I think they were being political legitimately, but they let that be their focus and lost track on the pitch. And that hurt them, I think.
When I was in my radio years, I got to interview one of the Canadian women's 15s. Her name was Ashley something. She's about 5'8", 5'6". I thought, don't mess with this girl. She could turn you into a tent peg in a heartbeat. And then I watched their game, and I just thought, this is mildly wild. And I thought, there's no better sport on the planet to watch. And the games are like 15 minutes long.
You've convinced me.
Yeah.
Well, and you have
3
to
or 4
remember,
games a day.
every sport has its own ethos.
Yeah.
Rugby has always presented itself as being a counterpoint to soccer. And the old adage was, soccer is a gentleman's sport played by hooligans, and rugby is a hooligan sport played by gentlemen.
Yeah.
So you are expected to beat the hell out of each other on the pitch, and then go and have a beer together.
Yeah.
As soon as the game is over, it is
It's kind
over.
of like hockey, that way. I find guys will, like, same thing. They'll beat each other up on the ice and then go for beers later. So.
I'm constantly fascinated by soccer, football, and how disrespectful a lot of the players are to the officials, to each other. And when I've watched quite a bit of rugby, and you don't get that. They literally beat the crap out of each other for the entire match, and then they're friends afterwards.
Yeah.
I live very close to the rugby pitch in Langford that has the Women's 7 program. So,
Which, by the way, that is a beautiful,
Yes.
beautiful.
Starlight Stadium, I think it's called.
Surface, though, to play rugby on.
Yeah, it's a fantastic arena. If you're in the area and you have the opportunity to catch some women's rugby, it's great. Shifting gears to cricket, I actually played cricket when I was younger. We had an Indian expat who was a teacher at my school, and he was doing almost like a teaching sabbatical where he came to my school for a couple of years, and then he ended up going back to India. But he was a huge cricket nut. So he got an inter-school league going. And this was in elementary school. So we had never heard of cricket. I'd never played it in my life. And I loved it. But there's not a lot of cricket to consume in Canada. It doesn't have the same level of fan support.
Here's my question: as someone who knows, like I said, I've watched days of it. I don't quite understand it. Can anybody give us people a brief tutorial?
When I was working in Courtenay, a gentleman tried to teach us cricket, and the rules, I went, what? The rules are so difficult to follow.
I just couldn't.
You have to play your way into it.
Is that what it is?
It's like most sports. I'm not going to try and go through a detailed explanation of cricket on the run right now because it does take a while. But the best thing to do is go down to Beacon Hill Park on a weekend. And an interesting factoid for you, the first international cricket match in the world, Canada versus the United States.
Wow, that surprised me. I would have thought that it would have been
You would
New
think so.
Zealand and Australia.
Nope.
And one thing I like to explain, like when I was trying to teach myself cricket, like we just goofed around as kids. We never really got deep into it. But I actually, I try and compare sports to one another that are different.
Absolutely.
And you take, if you know one sport well, you can take that knowledge and transition it to another sport. And a lot of people try and compare hockey and lacrosse because they look similar from the surface.
They're quite different, but there are similarities.
Lacrosse and basketball are far closer together.
I never thought of that before.
It's from a coaching perspective. If you look at lacrosse and basketball, they're virtually identical. Obviously,
never
one
thought
has
of that.
sticks and they're beating the hell out of each
Yeah.
other, but they're very similar to each other. Now, cricket, I think one of the closest analogs that you can think of cricket would actually be baseball.
Yes.
They're very similar.
Absolutely. Like I played kitty can when I was a kid. Do you know what kitty can?
I've never heard of kitty can.
Okay, so kitty can reminds
kitty can
me
in
of
England
cricket.
is called rounders.
Rounders.
Okay.
And it's the same sort of...
I've heard of rounders.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, we
Rounders
called
is
it
that
kitty
hybrid
can.
English
between.
call it, yeah.
But that's what cricket reminded me of
Yeah.
when I watched it, was kitty can.
So as I was saying, if you want to understand it, go down to Beacon Hill Park and sit with somebody who understands the game and go through, they're called overs. In baseball, we'd call them innings, but go through about 10 overs. It'll take you about 40 minutes, and you can have the full understanding of how the game plays. It's even better when you go to the six-a-side matches, which is played on the full pitch, but it tends to be international. Think of seven-a-side rugby, six-a-side cricket, and there's usually a festive element, so there's quite often a beer garden with it.
Oh,
and to sit and watch
you got
that,
me.
Sold.
You got me a beer garden from there.
it was an easy sell. Come on, Chris.
Yeah, I find cricket and baseball have a lot in common. The basic premise is similar. You got a pitcher throwing it, a bowler. You got a batter who's... The only difference is obviously the cricket pitch is circular. So you can, if you're good, you can hit it backwards.
Yeah.
So that's one of the differences. There's no triangle for a foul.
You bat 360 degrees as opposed to a 90-degree fair zone.
Yeah, if cricket is actually a lot of fun to watch, and I'm fascinated how these players can catch the ball. And now a cricket ball is considerably harder than a baseball.
It is.
And it's
because it's got a wooden center and it's wrapped with leather.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's also rough on one side and smooth on the other side.
I don't think I've ever seen a cricket ball up close.
It looks a lot like a billiard ball. And it has stitching in the middle like a baseball, but it's circular and has a rough side. And those bowlers can just fire that ball. It's quite impressive how hard they can throw it.
When I watched it, you could tell that they could throw the ball quite hard.
Yeah,
and the catching is kind of crazy too.
It's faster than baseball pitching.
And they're bouncing it
because you've got to run up and you're coming from great height. So it's up here. So you're effectively a pitcher in baseball who would be about 7'6".
Randy Johnson style.
Yeah, but bigger.
Yeah.
and you're running in from second.
So it's hand it to TSN a few weeks ago. They showed a cricket highlight of a guy bare hand catching cricket ball.
Yeah.
And
Well,
thought,
the only-
how did he not break all his bones in his hand catching that thing?
The only person on the field that's wearing gloves, and now forgive me, I don't know the term, but he's the catcher, is behind the wickets. And
the wicket keeper.
The wicket keeper. So he's
keeper for short. But
he's wearing gloves, but they're basically like gloves that you would see in a football keeper wearing.
Yeah, I remember watching that and being amazed by
actually
that.
they're wearing two pairs of gloves. Yeah. There's a soft leather
Oh,
inside,
interesting.
and then the proper glove.
So they actually have some padding.
Yeah.
Some.
But as I was saying when we were outside, the close fielders have positions. There's two positions. One's called the silly mid-on and one's called the silly mid-off, because you are playing literally 2 meters in front of the batsman on either the offside.
So do they just pick the crazy guy on the team?
Yeah, but you have to have great faith. That crazy person has to have great faith in his or her bowler.
So this might be an odd question, but are there a lot of injuries in cricket?
Like any
due
sport?
to that?
Sure. Yeah, you get broken bones sometimes. If your bowler doesn't do his or her job and the ball is up there to slash away at and the fielder's in the way, you get hurt.
Yeah.
Now, one nice thing about the internet is you can get access to a lot of these different sports. Chris, do you know of any resources online if somebody wanted to start watching cricket?
Well, just Google cricket, but it's also, you need to understand the history of it. It's a Commonwealth sport. Mm-hmm. So anywhere you go in the British Commonwealth, there will be cricket played somewhere. A lot of the players here in Victoria show that lineage. They're West Indian.
Yep.
They're Indo-Canadian, and this is a desperately important part of their history, their family. So they go out and support it, and you hear all sorts of languages around the pitch, sometimes colorful.
Oh, like any sport. I like it.
Like the show.
Other Chris fit in great.
Not here.
Yeah, the foul-mouthed Chris.
When I was a kid, my dad took me to a rugby match at Empire Stadium in Vancouver, and the Australian Navy was in town, and it was the New Zealand All Blacks against the Canadian rep side. And the Aussie sailors behind us says, "Kill the Kiwi bastards!" And my dad was going, Don't
listen to that.
Yeah. And I thought, that's rugby.
It's camaraderie.
Yeah.
The whole All Blacks, the dance they do at the beginning or their ceremony
Haka.
is like, my friend is from there, and he did it one night. We were out at a bar, maybe having a couple drinks, and it's
intimidating.
It's intimidating.
Do you know which haka he did?
I have no idea, but it was so impressive and scary at the same time. Everybody's like looking at us.
His eyes would just go crazy.
There's some really neat. I find there's some really neat traditions in sport around the world, and the haka is obviously very, it's well known even by non-rugby fans just because of how striking it is. There's always some fun videos of the All Black, the men's side, doing the haka before a match, and the other team looking at them like they're about to play against a bunch of crazy people.
It's true. It would be so intimidating to be the other team, like really.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it would be nice. It would be neat to kind of see if. Because there's some really striking Indigenous dances in Canada, too. It'd be interesting to see if they could do like the Canadian side of it.
If you watch the Samoan side, they do a variation of it called the sipitao. Mm-hmm. And it's also, they're war dances.
Oh, now I'm going to look at that now.
Oh, yeah.
Because I find it
You'll go
very
down a YouTube rabbit hole. They're fantastic.
Oh, yeah, they are. Now,
I'm going to spend my whole night on YouTube now.
Just because of my history, when I first graduated from UVic, I went to New Zealand to play rugby for a year and played for a club side in Auckland, Grafton, and Palmerston North Teachers College, and ended up in the Maori Studies section at Palmerston North, and went back 30 years later doing some protocol for the city, and we went to Napier, which is a Victoria's sister city there, and we were welcomed to a Maori Murai, and I was patched up with, because I was an unelected official, I was patched up with the elder at the Murai, and he and I just had a bond, and he had this old laconic way of speaking. So, lad, have you been to New Zealand before? And I said, well, yeah, 30 years ago I was here playing rugby. He said, oh, I played for my county into my 50s. And I went, wow. Okay, you're frightening. Wow. But he made me an honorary Maori. So I may be the only natural-born Canadian who is also an honorary Maori. And I have done a haka.
Oh, that's cool.
Oh, that's very cool.
It's scary. And
is there internet evidence that I can link?
Fortunately, when I was young, it was before social media.
Well, that's disappointing.
You're off the hook.
No, it's great.
One thing I really found when I was in Australia, because they like to, people are always like, well, rugby, Aussie rules, football, very similar. It's amazing the structure, it's very different.
Yes.
And the athletes, even the way they're structured is completely different. I find the Aussie rules football players are lean, long legs, run they run faster. The rugby players have the big quads, the very strong.
For the scrum.
It's pretty amazing, like the difference between.
Because you tend to run through people
Yes,
more in rugby.
yes.
And Aussie rules is an aerial game.
It is absolutely
You
an
have to
aerial
go
game.
up and you take all that punishment up in the air.
But
trying to get
unless
a
you
mark.
know or you've watched both, a lot of people just think they're the same sport, and they are completely different.
And it's not mayhem if you watch it carefully. It's very organized.
Aussie rules football, it gets
It's
it,
rough.
it has an interesting, stigma for the people that don't watch it, how it's like this violent, chaotic mess of a sport, but it's a rough game.
They are pretty
but
brutal.
it's,
Like if somebody's
it's
injured,
very
they're
structured.
going at you.
Yeah,
Like,
it's a structured game. I've watched a lot of Aussie rules football.
It is
And
structured, for
I
sure.
found there's actually an Aussie rules kind of men's league here in the CRD.
Oh, wow, I had no
and
idea.
I was going through the process of contacting a team to go out and start playing with them just before COVID hit. So that kind of went
would've been
sideways.
so
But
fun.
It's fairly new then, because there used to be a group that would get together just to kick a ball around under Aussie rules style. And
this one was at a Vic High.
Yeah, and they started it at Central Middle School, which is just down from Vic High. But I didn't know that they'd expanded to a league. So that's great. And there is
I don't know if calling it a league was really the right term. It was just
yeah.
it
in
was
their minds they're a league.
yeah. There was a couple of
Got to
teams.
start somewhere.
There was a couple of teams, and they got together for scrims and stuff like
Well,
that.
and there is a young lad from St. Michael's University School who played for the Canadian national rugby squad and then converted over to Aussie rules, and his name is Mike Pike, and he ended up being the MVP at one of the national finals in
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah,
That's cool.
That's amazing. I mean, a lot of kickers from Aussie rules football end up in the NFL.
Yeah. And they kick the ball differently. You're not in football, you want to kick a spiral.
Yeah.
In Aussie rules, you don't.
Yeah, you want it end over end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can get just as much length if you do it properly.
In the way Dave Cutler used to kick it, but we call it toe bashing.
Yes.
Now, Chris,
Yes.
it's your turn. What do you got for us?
Well, I got called, I think, because Steve read an op-ed piece I did in the newspaper about Canadian pride.
Okay.
And when I was a law student,
touched.
was many years ago now, and it was 1980, and there was a referendum in Quebec about separation.
I actually drove to
remember
that. I was a journalism student, and I actually went to the referendum.
And in 1980, it failed. But I started at that
It
point
did.
saying, okay, as an individual, I can wear a maple leaf every day. I won't have a tattoo. I won't go that route because that doesn't force me to think about it. So I still, 50-something years later, I still, 41 years later, I still wear a maple leaf every day, and I have to think about putting it on. So I wrote an op-ed piece saying, okay, we're a generation removed from the referendums, but we're having a tough time in Canada at the moment for a range of different issues, all of which are legitimate. But think about the things that are positive.
So do we think that athletes have lost that loving feeling for Canada?
It wasn't just about sports. I listed 10 of my favorite Canadian icons, Terry Fox being one, but Joanna Rochette being another, for winning a bronze medal just days after her mother had died. And she just graduated from the University of McGill. She's a doctor.
Wow.
She's going to carry on. It can be in any area you want, but I would argue that we won a gold medal in men's sprinting with Ben Johnson, and it was then tarnished.
Yes.
Absolutely, was
We-
tarnished.
We came back 8 years later and won a second gold medal, and we were restored because it wasn't tarnished. That's hard. People forget that when Ben Johnson lost his gold medal, actually 7 of the 8 finalists were all caught doping.
Well, and again, that's the thing. I mean, it's like Tour de France, right?
Yeah.
So
So I think we have lots of sports icons, but there are a range of other icons. I mean, Oscar Peterson in music.
Oh yeah. I think there are. I think what we need to talk about though is the aspect of Canadian pride amongst athletes.
Yep.
And are they losing? Are we losing that because maybe they're getting involved in too much activism and they're losing their love for their country? I don't know. I mean, there are reasons why a lot of us might be a little less prideful to be Canadian these days.
Christine Sinclair would argue, and her example would argue the opposite, that she's one of those we should hold out as an icon.
Yeah.
Clara Hughes, another. I mean, I think there are a range of ones, because if we only talk about the stuff that destroys the country, we will destroy it.
Oh, absolutely.
We need to
I
talk
agree.
about the things that bind us together.
I agree, and
that
there's
pride
so many.
quite often shows up on the field or on the court.
And you start talking about people like Silk and Lawman.
Yeah.
Oh,
Canadian
absolutely.
grit.
I think that Terry Fox gets not enough recognition for. I mean, he's probably the top athlete that I can think of. I'm sorry, just what he did and what he did for a cause was so remarkable. There are no words to
Rick
express.
Hansen would be
Rick
another.
Hansen is
Rick
another great example.
I'll give you a local one, and it's not particularly him. His dad was one of my rugby coaches, but Gareth Rees, who is a great athlete on the rugby pitch in his own right. He's a very good spokesperson. But what people don't recognize is when the Canadian men's team went to the World Cup, particularly the Invictus one, the one in South Africa, they were staying in the Eastern Township, so a black community. They went out and worked with the kids in that black community, and when they left, they did a whip around and left a $5,000 scholarship so kids could be elevated through sports.
I love that story, and I think part of the Canadian pride thing and why we're losing it is because mainstream media shoves negative news down our throats on a consistent basis, where a story like that kind of gets lost, right? They don't want to talk about the positive things that athletes are doing. So that's a great story, and I think those are the things that we need to see coming to the forefront more often.
So kudos to Gareth Rees, and I
Absolutely.
remember him as a 9-year-old. I played not only rugby but also cricket for his father, and I remember him as a 9-year-old coming out and just being a rugrat on the side, and he then went on to an astounding
I got a
story.
story about
There's
Gareth.
so many
I've
athletes.
got some rugby swag, Canadian rugby swag. Out of the 5 or 6 pieces I got, only one is not a gift from Gareth Rees. So for that, I'm very grateful. And he said, not a great interview, but so what? He
Well,
did
it is.
he was
And
the
some
first
people just
Canadian-
aren't. I mean,
he was the
it's
first
a-
Canadian to play team or league rugby in Britain, wasn't he?
Certainly one of them. Hans de Goede may have
Hans de
actually.
Goede. I think that he came after.
I think he was before.
There are a
But I'm
lot
not
of
sure.
athletes doing
Ever shaken hands
really
in
great
hand?
things around,
Like
like
you
for
shake
Canada.
Chris, I have a question for you.
You may ask. I may not answer, but go ahead and ask.
So, other Chris mentioned
yes.
mentioned mainstream media pushing the negative narrative that may be dampening the Canadian pride, not just in sports, but it does trickle down into that. And I know Chris and I both come from an Indigenous background, so obviously the news in the last year or so has been very challenging for my family, and I'm sure Chris is in a similar side of things. So the pride I felt as a Canadian was definitely tarnished.
Yes.
And because it was, a lot of this has to do with because it was Canada that did this. You've got all these countries around the world, and every country's got skeletons, obviously. And this is just fresh in my mind, and this is something that has affected my family. So
And that's
it
something
feels-
people need to remember. Just because it didn't happen to us personally, usually down the line,
yeah.
residential schools affected someone in our families.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that trickles down.
So, Chris, my question to you is: you came at this angle as looking at the positive side of things. What advice would you give to someone that maybe is having a hard time with the Canadian identity? What kind of advice would you pass along to them?
So one of the, not one of the sports people, but one of the people in my list of 10 was Chief Cadmus Delorme from the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan, who was interviewed shortly after they found the 751 unmarked graves. And his response, and he's a young chief in his nation, and his response was, this wasn't done by us, this generation, and I am a proud Canadian, but we need to accept the truth. And part of that goes back to, I love Canadians, but sometimes we're a bunch of doubting Thomases. we know, and you know better than I'm sure.
And we just like to turn a blind eye to negativity.
But we had a Royal Commission for Aboriginal people in 1996. There were thousands of stories that came forward that told us we would find this, and we chose to bury our heads in the sand.
Of course we did, because that's
15 years later.
What happens.
15 years later, we had the Truth and Reconciliation. Again, they told us. Now, because we've suddenly used ground-penetrating radar, we now believe it. So there's a disconnect there that we have to go to. But I loved Chief Cadmus, Delorme's presentation, that I can still be a proud Canadian, and yes, we have to not only accept the fact, the truths of the past, whether we like them or not, but we need to work together.
And I'd like to touch on that just for a moment. Like, I knew about residential schools for quite some time, and I know someone that locally that it greatly affected. Like, there are no words to describe what these people went through, because there are people who survived it and who speak of it. Now, as far as Canadian pride, I think that as bad as some of our history is, because there's some bad history, but there's bad history in every country. I don't condone what happened. I think there's certain people that should pay for what happened. But in the grand scheme of things, when we look at our country, there are a lot of things to be grateful for. If you look around the world at other countries, sure, we can be ashamed of some things that that have happened, and we need to try and right the wrong. And it doesn't mean, and I'm not taking away from the orange shirts, but it's not just commenting on it because you feel the need to comment it. It's not just wearing an orange shirt for a day. It's continuing to remember what happened, and every day trying to wake up and do something to be a better person and help people and push issues like this to the forefront to make a change.
I know when the news of the 215 in Kamloops came out, that day my heart literally sank.
Oh, it did for everybody.
There are no words, but in the grand scheme of things, this country, there's a lot to be prideful about.
So the question then that comes from that is, where to from here? As individuals, so a friend of mine said, well, you might want to take a look. The University of Alberta does a great online course called Indigenous Canada. It's 12 weeks. If I did it for half an hour a night, 6 nights a week, I did it in 1 month. I'm an overachiever. But it takes us back and teaches us some truths about why did we try and go through the assimilative process. What was the reason? Why were we trying to break up the relationship between elders and the second and third generation and the passing of knowledge orally? Because that was, so it's all those things. It's a great course. And the more I note that almost 400,000 Canadians have gone through the course now. It's reasonably recent. It's taught by First Nations elders. And I was delighted in one of the lessons, they actually referenced one of my cousins who's teaching Aboriginal studies at the University of Guelph. So those things are important, but we only get it by keeping open minds and open hearts and working forward together, because there are lots of points of pride, but if we only focus on the negative crap, we will fail.
And again, that's what I was speaking of mainstream media. I mean, there were so many great things this year. I mean, like, and we'll go with the sports thing, like the women winning Canadian gold in soccer was probably the highlight of the year. And I'll tell you, I was not a soccer fan, but I sure watched that game, and I sure felt a sense of pride when they won that. And it's little things like that. I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan. I'll tell you, I couldn't, sure, we didn't win a cup, but the amount of pride I had, and watching Carey Price and how composed and what an amazing athlete he is, and just, you know, he was going through all that with the rest of the country and keeping his composure and being very poised, because he was asked questions about residential schools and his mother, and, you know, and he kept his focus and brought that team to a final.
Even locally, we had some disturbances here locally and violence being perpetrated on the historic wrongs of the past. And the 13 chiefs bring forward a letter saying violence is not the answer. I mean, we should take extraordinary pride, because it would be easy to be angry. And there's lots of reasons. And they didn't. They went the other route and said, no, we need to work together. We need to be able to discuss these and come to a resolution that lets us all move forward. That is extraordinary.
And I think that is probably a good place to end it right there. I want to thank our guests today. We've got Chris Schill, Chris Coleman, Steve Duffy. Thanks so much for coming in today, and a great episode. Appreciate it. Be sure to head over to our Instagram. We've got Raw Sportscast on Instagram, My Call podcast on Instagram as well. You can hit us up on email, mycallpodcast@gmail.com, if you have ideas for roundtable events. If you have guest ideas, hit me up. We'll definitely look into it. Once again, thanks to our guests and our sponsors.
I miss you, Scott.
Yes, Scott, Independent Sports News, as well as Howie's Car Corral. So once again, thanks so much for tuning in.
I miss you, Scott, too.
Miss you, Scott.
Everybody misses Scott. You hear that, Scott?
Don't miss the Leafs, but I miss Scott.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.